Welcome to the Law Simplified course on company law. I'm your instructor, Shaveen Bandaranayake. Throughout your LLB or study of law, you'll encounter modules or subjects which have an affinity to our day-to-day lives. For instance, in the first year, we would have studied contract law, which is something that we encounter on a daily basis, from buying a loaf of bread all the way to signing up for car insurance, let's say. Similarly, company law is something that you encounter later on in your LLB or your law degree, which essentially, if you're in the corporate sector or dealing with some person in the corporate sector, that you might encounter and have to deal with. As such, company law in the context of common law or the English legal system is quite vast and at times complicated. The basis of company law that has been founded in the UK has been seen all over the world, primarily in Commonwealth countries, as well as adopted in certain other senses in civil law jurisdictions as well. Now, specifically with the involvement of the EU, we'll see later on in this subject, there are provisions and regulations that have altered or changed the original precepts of company law as well. Having said that, considering the vastness of this subject and the fact that the Law Simplified program or the course that you see here today is meant to summarize as well as simplify this subject, it has been necessary to break this subject into three formal areas. Firstly, in relation to the formation of the company. Secondly, on how it's operated. And finally, the responsibilities or the duties of the parties involved, as well as how a company in itself comes to an end. Having said that, we'll first move on by identifying part one, namely the various forms of business organization, how in itself can a company be formed. Secondly, looking at the nature of what is known as a legal personality, the fact that a company can in itself be sued as well as sue others. It is in itself an individual before the law. The lifting of the veil of incorporation, the safeguards afforded to the individuals, to the directors and the members of the company, how exactly a company is formed, as well as the various contracts that those who are not directors of the company as yet enter into as pre-incorporation contracts, the requirements of raising capital or assets or funds in order to start the company on an equitable premise, as well as that of debentures. Part one essentially then looks at the very formation or starting up of the company itself. Following this, we will move on to part two, which fundamentally considers the operation of the company. The share capital aspects, dealing with the parties that are within the company or insiders, the various class rights that are applicable to individuals, the derivative claims of parties, as well as the safeguards afforded to minority shareholders, the statutory protection that are afforded to them. Finally, part 3 will move on to much more granular and substantial aspects of dealing with third parties or outsiders as legal personalities on their own, the very management of the company itself, the responsibilities or uberrima fide, utmost good faith that individuals should have with the company, the fiduciary nature of it, and finally, the unfortunate circumstances of liquidation when a company has to come to an end. Now, unlike many other courses that you would have seen in the Law Simplified program that we've gone through, this in itself is quite vast. It's quite technical, and it's governed primarily by the Companies Act of 2006. When we go through these topics, when you go through the individual areas of company law of this module, you'll notice that the provisions of the Companies Act of 2006 is what's fundamental for us to understand. While there are several case law and precedent cases which are applicable, for the most part, it will revolve around the Companies Act of 2006. We will now begin this course with our next lesson, which starts off with part 1 of company law, which is forms of business organization.